In this video, I'm going to walk through the translation of verses 6 through 10 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John, the Latin translation of St. Jerome of verses 6 through 10 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of John. Let's begin with a reading of these 5 verses, and then we'll walk through the translation. Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Notice the accent, Ioannes. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. In mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non cognovit. Okay, so verses 6 through 10, make sure you practice pronunciation, reading things with ecclesiastical Latin pronunciation in this course, because this is Christian Latin. Now we can go through and work out our translation. Remember, working word by word from beginning to end, not moving things around, not changing word order, just word for word from beginning to end. We want to learn word for word translation because when the Romans or any Latin speakers spoke or heard this, this is exactly as it was spoken, as it was heard, as it was understood. They didn't have to move words around and things like that. This is exactly how the language was understood. So we want to translate it word for word, keeping all of the original word order in our English translation. We'll start at the beginning, verse 6. Fuit. Fuit is a verb, and we're going to translate it as there was. There was. Homo. Homo is a substantive noun. It means a man. There was a man. In verses 1 through 5, the subject was verbum, the word. And in the later part of that lesson was lux, the light. So we looked at the word and the light. Now in verse 6, we have a new subject being introduced. There was a man. We don't know who this man is yet. We're going to find out in these verses, but a new subject is introduced, a man. There was a man. Missus. If you think of a missile is something that's sent. Missus is a participle that means sent. There was a man sent by or from God. There was a man, missus a Deo, sent by God or sent from God. And let me make 2 notes here. The word, this is an example of a Latin word made of 1 letter. This is actually a shortened form of the preposition ab. Ab means by or from. What happens here is because the preposition is followed by a word that begins with a consonant, the consonant B is dropped off of the preposition just to make it easier to pronounce. Adeo is much easier to pronounce than abdeo. So the B is dropped and we have adeo. So if you were to try to find the word in a Latin dictionary, you wouldn't find it because the word is actually ab. Okay? But that's what happens there. The B is dropped because it's followed by a consonant. Deo is the same word that we've already seen twice. We've seen deus, we've seen deum, and now we see deo. These are all the same noun, deus, but they're different cases. Here we have the ablative case. Deo is the ablative case of deus. All right, so these are not different words, they're simply different forms of the same word. The same meaning is present in each of them, but the cases change because they're used in different ways. A Deo, by God. There was a man sent by or from God. Cui. Cui is a pronoun, which means for whom. For whom. Nomen. The name. For whom the name erat was Ioannes. In English, this is John. There was a man sent by God for whom the name was John. So here, the identity is learned of this new character in our reading. There was a man sent from God for whom the name was John. Now we learn more about this man. This, and we can put man in parentheses here to make our English clearer. This man, venit, came in testimonium. And we have a little explaining to do here because this is going to translate as for a testimony. This man came for a testimony. Now look, this is the preposition in. We saw the preposition in lesson 1, and we translated it as just in. Remember, in principio, in the beginning. But here, the preposition in is being translated differently. It's translated as for. Now, the reason why is because prepositions can have a number of different meanings. And I'll show you one of the reasons why the meaning is different here. In verse 1, remember this is verse 6 through 10, I'm talking about the previous lesson. In verse 1, we saw in principio. In principio. That principio was an ablative case. When the preposition in is followed by an ablative case noun, it can have a certain number of different meanings. Here, the preposition in is followed by the noun testimonium, which is in the accusative case, a different case. And when in is followed by an accusative case, it can have a different set of meanings. If you looked up the preposition in a Latin dictionary, you'd see that. It would say something like this. In the dictionary, it would say in plus accusative or in plus ablative, and then it would give you the meanings that it can have. All right? So the meaning of these prepositions can be a little more complicated than simple vocabulary. Here, in is going to translate as for, and in future verses, you're going to find in with even more meanings. So on a test for a lesson, you're going to have to make sure that you give the meaning of the preposition in that actually comes from that lesson. Okay, so just because the word in verse 1 means in, if you take an assessment on verse 7, the word in, if you put in, it's going to be wrong, because in verse 7, the meaning is for. All right? You'll learn why all of that is in Latin Grammar 1, but I want you to see that prepositions can have a number of different meanings, And the case of the noun that follows the preposition tells us what those meanings can be. Okay? This man came for a testimony, ut. Ut is a conjunction that means so that. This man came for a testimony. Why did he come for a testimony? So that, testimonium, a testimony, perhiberet, is a verb. He might give. This man came for a testimony so that a testimony he might give. One note about the verb perhiberet, you'll notice it says he might give. It doesn't say so that a testimony he gives, or so that a testimony he gave, or so that a testimony he shall give. It says he might give. This is an example of mood as one of the accidents of verbs. This is an example of mood. In Latin Grammar 1, Lesson 3, we learned about the accidents of the parts of speech. We learned about 10 different accidents of the parts of speech, and one that we learn is modus, which means mood, different manners of expressing actions in verbs. Excuse me. This is an example of a different mood. Not he gives. It's not a simple statement of facts. He gives. It's a statement of potential. He might give. That he might give. So that a testimony he might give. All right, that's an example of a different verb mood. De lumine. De is another preposition. We give testimony about something. He came so that a testimony he might give about lumine, the light. Remember, we saw light in verses 1 through 5, but it was a different noun. It was the noun lux. Lumine is a form of the noun lumen, which is a different noun, but it also means light. He came so that a testimony he might give about the light, de lumine. Why? Why did he give a testimony about the light? So that, so that all. Now remember, again in verses 1 through 5, we saw the adjective omnia, all things. Omnes is another form of that same adjective. Omnia was a neuter adjective. It meant all things, omnia. Here we have a masculine form of that same adjective. Here it refers to all men, so that all men, we could put men in parentheses, it's masculine and plural, so that all men crederent, we have another verb, all men might believe. If you learn the Apostles' Creed, the Apostles' Creed starts with credo. Credo means I believe. Crederent is another form of that same verb. It means they, remember we said all men might believe. Crederent. This is another example of a different mood. Same as here. He might give, they might believe. Okay? They might believe. Per, by or through, we learned that in verses 1 to 5. And then illum is a pronoun that means him. So that was a long verse 7 there. This man came for a testimony, so that a testimony he might give de lumine, about the light, so that all men crederent, might believe, per illum, by him or through him. Verse 8, non erat ille lux. Non we learned in verse 5, not. It's an adverb. Erat, was. Non erat, not was. Ille, he. Ille, illum. Same pronoun, two different forms. Ille is a nominative case. Illum is the accusative case. Okay, same pronoun, different forms. Here it's he. Not was he, lux. We already know that. The light. Said. We learned et as a conjunction. We've learned ut as a conjunction, so that here we have another conjunction. Said means but. But, said, ut, so that, testimonium, a testimony, perhiberet, he might give, de lumine, we already saw that, about the light. All right, so verse 8 tells us that he was not the light that we talked about in verses 1 through 5. John was not the verbum. He was not the lux that we learned about. He's someone else. He was not the light, but so that a testimony he might give de lumine, about the light. Okay, verse 8. Verse 9. Erat lux vera. We can say it was, or he was, lux, the light. Vera is an adjective that means true. Vera means true. He was, yeah, we should say he was to make it clearer. He was the true light. Lux vera, the true light. Notice that the adjective in Latin usually comes after the substantive that it describes. He was the true light. He was the light true. Keep the original word order. He was the light true. Keep the word order, but understand what it means. He was the light true, que, which. Illuminat is almost exactly as it is in English. We could say illuminates, but in your lesson, we use the verb enlightens. He was the true light which enlightens. Omnem, we saw omnes. Omnes is plural. Omnem is singular. And we're going to translate it differently because it's singular. Instead of all, which is plural, we're going to translate it as every, which is singular. Every hominem, man. And again, we have another form of this noun, homo. So far we've seen homo, which is the nominative singular form, the dictionary form that you would look up to find the meaning. We've seen hominum in lesson 1, which means of men. And now we see hominem, which is the accusative singular form, which means man. He was the true light which enlightens every man. Venientem is a participle. It means coming. Up here, we saw the word venit, the verb venit, which means came. There it meant came. Here we see a participle which is derived from that verb. We see the same stem, veni, venientem, coming. It's present tense, coming in mundum. And here we're going to learn another meaning for the preposition in. Instead of in and instead of for, here the translation is going to be into. And you'll see that in is followed by an accusative form. So one of the possible meanings for in, when it's followed by an accusative, is into. Coming into mundum, the world. Mundum means world. So to go through verse 9 again. Erat lux vera, he was the true light, que illuminat, which enlightens, omnem hominem, every man, venientem, into the world, coming into the world. Verse 10, in mundo. Here we have in plus the ablative case, just like we did in principio. So the meaning here is going to be in. Mundo, in the world. In the world. In plus the ablative case, in the world. In plus the accusative case, in mundum, into the world. In mundo, in the world. See the difference? In mundum, into the world. In mundo, in the world. Erat, he was. Et, and. Mundus, the world. Right here we've seen three different cases of the noun mundus. Here we have the nominative, or the regular dictionary case, mundus, the world. Here we have mundum, the accusative case. Here we have mundo, the ablative case. Three different cases of the same word. Et mundus, the world, per ipsum, by or through him, factus. We learned in lesson 1, we learned facta, which means made and is plural. And then we learned factum, which is singular. Both of those mean made. Here we have factus, a different case. Factus, made, est, is. Et mundus, and the world. Eum, remember in lesson 1 we saw eam, which meant it. It was feminine, I said. Here we have eum, which is masculine. It means him. Non cognovit, not did know. Cognovit. You can see this stem, cognovit. If I see someone at the store and I say, hey, I know him, I say, I recognize. I recognize. That cogn is from the Latin to know. Cognosco means I know. Cognovit means did know or he knew. Okay? We could also use the past tense knew. All right, so there we have the translation of verses 6 through 10. Now let's walk back through it one time, nice and slow. We'll read all the Latin again, and then we'll go back through the whole translation to try to get the big picture of what we're reading about here. Okay? Fuit homo missus adeo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. In mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non cognovit. And you can also pronounce this in ecclesiastical Latin, the GN, instead of saying cognovit, you can change that to coniovit. Coniovit. That's a change that develops in ecclesiastical Latin. Okay? Now, as we get ready to walk through our translation again, let me just say something in general about Latin translation. Translation, as you'll see as we go through it, is very difficult work, and there are many different ways that this could be translated. You'll see if you pick up different English translations of the Bible, you'll see that the phrases are different. There's translations changing over time and so on. Translation is difficult work, and it's sort of always open to argument that there might be a better translation. What matters is, in the Catholic Church, what matters is that the Church approves of a translation. And when the Church approves of a translation, it's not saying that that's the only possible translation. It's just saying that that translation is approved and is considered to be true and safe for Catholics to study. You'll find different Catholic Bibles all approved with different translations. So don't think that the work of translation is this simple, mathematical formula that we work through. There's always room for different options. If you look up some of these words in a dictionary, like prepositions, you'll find that there's a whole list of possible meanings, and you could play around with them and find phrases that you think are a little clearer or better. There are also some places where, depending on what is actually being said, the translation could be different. And so the translator has to make decisions about what the passage means based on the rest of the context, and then allow that meaning to affect the translation and the choice of words and things like that. So don't think that translation is this black and white science where there's just one right answer, one right answer, one right answer. That's really not how translation works. It's a very complex work translating. There's lots of room for disagreement in translating. The Church approves translations that differ in some ways because there could be a couple different translations for this passage, and they're all right. Okay, so don't expect it to be an exact science, but in this course, all right, because in a course where we're going to have assessments, we have to settle on a translation for the sake of assessment. All right, so the translation that I teach you, and even more exactly, the translation that's found in the written lesson, is to be considered correct for our class. But I want you to understand that what's correct for our class is not necessarily what's right or what you'll find actually in an English Bible. It's also not the only right answer for the translation. There's lots of room for adjusting and changing things to get the ideas to be as clear as possible. But in this class, the translation we learn is considered correct for the sake of assessment. All right? So let's go now through this translation and see what the class translation will be. Fuit homo, there was a man, missus ad Deo, sent by God or sent from God. Both are correct. Cui, for whom nomen, the name, erat Ioannes, was John. Hic venit, this man came in testimonium, for a testimony, ut testimonium perhiberet, so that a testimony he might give de lumine, about the light, ut omnes crederent per illum, so that all men might believe through him. Verse 8, non erat ille lux, not was he the light, sed ut testimonium, but so that a testimony perhiberet de lumine, he might give about the light. Verse 9, erat lux vera, he was the light true, quae illuminat, which enlightens, omnem hominem, every man, venientem in mundum, coming into the world. Verse 10, in mundo erat, in the world he was, et mundus per ipsum, and the world by him, factus est, made is, or is made. Et mundus, and the world, eum non cognovit, him not did know, or knew. And the world did not know him, or the world knew him not. Okay? That's our class translation for verses 6 through 10 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John. If there are any slight differences in what I did here on the board that you find in the printed lesson or the published lesson on your course page, you should stick to the details of the printed lesson, because the lesson assessment is going to be based on that printed lesson. Okay, obviously, I talk about a lot of details in our translation videos that are not included in the simple, clear, published lessons online. For the sake of your studies, you should use the video as a pre-lection, which means sort of an introduction to the lesson. But for your exact study, as you prepare for your assessments, stick to the printed lesson text, okay? Because the assessments are based on the details that you find in your printed lesson. That's all for verses 6 through 10. I hope that provides a helpful introduction for you for the study of this lesson. Now it's time for you to get to work, start working on your translation exercises, and master this lesson so that you can pass your assessment and move on to the next 5 verses, verses 11 to 15 in lesson 3. I hope that's helpful. Get to work. God bless your studies.